New definitions for close contacts of COVID cases in WA will roll out on Tuesday, along with relaxed isolation protocols, slashing the quarantine period from 14 to 7 days. Key points. The new definitions were announced on January 28th. The new definitions were announced on January 28th. Mark McGowan says they are necessary amid a higher caseload. Mark McGowan says they are necessary amid a higher caseload. He says the rules will allow schools to stay open safely. WA Premier Mark McGowan says the new rules, which were first announced by the government in late January, were needed as Omicron continues to spread through the community. Under the new rules, anyone who tests positive for COVID-19 must self-isolate for a minimum of 7 days. At the 7-day point, if they still have symptoms, they must remain in isolation until those symptoms clear. If they have no symptoms after 7 days, the person is allowed to leave isolation without being required to undergo testing. The changes take effect tomorrow. Unsplash, Priscilla Dupreez. Under the new protocols, someone will be classified as a close contact if they are a household or intimate contact of a COVID-positive person and have had contact with them during their infectious period. They are a household or intimate contact of a COVID-positive person and have had contact with them during their infectious period, have had a close personal interaction with a COVID-positive person while masks were removed, including more than 15 minutes spent face-to-face, or 2 hours in a small room. Have had a close personal interaction with a COVID-positive person while masks were removed, including more than 15 minutes spent face-to-face, or 2 hours in a small room. Notified by WA Health they are close contact based on specific circumstances. There will no longer be testing requirements for casual contacts, but people are still urged to monitor exposure sites. There will also be relaxed isolation protocols introduced for interstate and international arrivals in WA from Wednesday, with their quarantine period also to be halved from 14 to 7 days. Travellers must, however, wear a mask in indoor and outdoor settings for the 7 days after their quarantine period ends. Quarantine rules have been relaxed for interstate and overseas arrivals. ABC News, Robert Konigluck. Vaccinated international arrivals will no longer need to hotel quarantine and can instead self-isolate if they can find a suitable premises. The cap on international arrivals in WA is also set to double to 530 per week. The new rules will not apply to the unvaccinated international arrivals, who are still required to undergo 14 days of hotel quarantine. Mr. McGowan said it was necessary to adopt the higher caseload guidelines, as case numbers were expected to rise in the coming days. It comes after the state recorded 26 new local COVID cases overnight, with authorities confirming several of them had been infectious in the community. Mr. McGowan said the new rules were designed to keep schools open, while allowing them to operate safely. Children identified as close contacts, ABC News, Simon Tucci. Definitions of close contacts and protocols for isolation in schools will be similar to the new rules being rolled out for the wider community. Some new measures that will be introduced at schools include prohibiting indoor face-to-face events. Prohibiting indoor face-to-face events, cancelling or postponing school camps. Cancelling or postponing school camps, dividing children into groups to limit mingling. Dividing children into groups to limit mingling, modification to timetables, break times, and pick-up and drop-off times, where practicable. A series of specific protocols for schools announced last month will be introduced when WA reaches a very high caseload of COVID-19 in the community. Rules mark beginning of pandemic for WA. Mr. McGowan warned the new rules did not mark the end of the pandemic for WA, saying it was more like the start of it. The road ahead is about to get very difficult, and so in many ways, the worst is still to come, and we are at the start of the pandemic now, he said. The last 2 years we have used effectively to get our vaccination rate up, to get more hospital beds online, to get first, second, and third doses, to get children vaccinated, to get the public prepared, to get all the protocols ready. Every other thing we have done over the course of the last 2 years has been to get ready for this point, because we haven't effectively had spread of the virus in Western Australia for 2 years. Now we are heading into a more difficult environment, but the good thing is with our vaccination levels, we will be better prepared than any other state in Australia for this point. Mark McGowan also confirmed that the hundreds of people already undergoing 14 days of mandatory quarantine in WA would be allowed to leave earlier. Once they have done 7 days of isolation, provided they have a negative test, they will be free to go, he said. Separated families celebrate changes. Among those celebrating the news from isolation was Perth woman Pippa Hurst and her daughter Cameron, who had moved to Melbourne a few years ago. There was a lot of cheering in our household when we heard the news, Ms. Cameron said. It didn't make sense to have people locked down for 2 whole weeks. We've all had our boosters, we triple vaccinated, so we think it's the right decision. Pippa Hurst and her daughter, Cameron, had not seen each another in years. Supplied. Cameron Hurst flew into Perth from Melbourne on Saturday, and her Perth-based parents chose to join her for 2 weeks of self-quarantine at their home. It was just really sad and hard being stuck in Melbourne, and I'm really close to my family, and I really wanted to see them, she said. My grandma was really happy. She texted me saying, "Woohoo, 7 days, everyone was really pleased." With limited time off work, Cameron was only going to have a few days in Perth after isolating before she was due to fly out. I think it's really hard when you're a long way from your kids, and everyone is trying to put on a brave face, and there's a lot of tears and a lot of emotion that you try not to focus on, Pippa Hurst said. When you finally do get to see someone again, it's really quite emotional. It is so terrible not having any certainty, when you know you can't give your kids a hug when they are stuck. Reduced quarantine, good news for schools. It is positive news for hundreds of staff and students from several Perth schools who were forced into isolation, including dozens of children from a Beaconsfield primary school in years 3 and 4. For young children who require more care, a parent or guardian is required to isolate alongside them if they are a close contact. Such was the case for Frances Barnes and her son, 8-year-old Titiwa Joe, who is a student at Winterfold Primary School. Frances Barnes and her son Titiwa Joe had to isolate for 2 weeks. Supplied. They went into self-quarantine last Tuesday after 2 teachers at the school tested positive for COVID-19. Ms. Barnes hoped the new rules meant they would be allowed out of isolation tomorrow, but she said they were waiting for official advice from WA Health. Ms. Barnes said she has been working from home, but for others who had been forced to take time off, the impacts were severe. Titiwa Joe says he misses his school friends. Supplied. She also said it was not easy on young children and quite disruptive to their education. It's important to balance the containment of the virus with psychological and financial considerations and stuff, she said. It's very disruptive for learning and for parents that have to work. It's very stressful to balance that learning. I think it's definitely a good idea to cut it to 7 days. That's what they've done over East and overseas in most places. Penalty for failure to register RAT results. Rapid antigen tests will now be used by WA Health alongside its PCR testing regime. Rapid antigen tests provide a quick result and are useful in a high caseload environment, Health Minister Amber Jade Sanderson said. Our state-run clinics will have a supply of RATs that they can use when it is not possible to administer a PCR test because demand is too high. Our clinics will also provide RATs to be used later in the isolation period or at day 7 ahead of coming out of self-isolation. Amber Jade Sanderson says, ABC News, James Carmody. Ms. Sanderson said, in line with national advice, the tests were safe to use on children from the age of 2. She said children aged 12 to 17 could perform the test themselves with a parent or guardian supervising. Anyone who records a positive RAT test result that was self-administered at home will face up to 12 months in prison or a $50,000 fine if they fail to register it with the health department. Ms. Sanderson said people should continue to use PCR